So we said that the reason and the result of exile is that a person considers the wilderness to be big, meaning that there's more weight to the uninhabited parts of reality than there is to the inhabited parts, because the wilderness represents the uninhabited. So he says this means a number of things. One of the things it can mean is that the person is too impressed by his animal soul, which is the part that is not inhabited and needs to be domesticated. But what he's concentrating on in this Sikha is that he considers the rest of the non-Jewish world to be big. And big in the sense that it has more weight in his eyes. So, and even more than that, he says within the Jewish people, he sees that the number of people that are keeping Torah mitzvahs is small. So they're inhabited, and they correspond to the inhabited part of the world. And the ones that don't, they're the uninhabited. And that seems much bigger and much weightier. So he gives it more precedence. So it says that's the first stage of descent into exile. And now he's not talking about just the exile of every individual. He's also talking about the exile of the entire people. That the whole problem that we have is that the people that lead us are people who exactly think that way. That they think that whatever the non-Jews are doing, that's great. And whatever we have to do, no, it's old-fashioned, it's this, it's that. They don't get it. They just don't understand. And it's not their fault because they're in exile. That's how they see the world. So we're on page 77 on the left column, second paragraph. אבל כשאדם עורך חישוב של המדבר הגדול מייחס חשיבות לעולם כשהוא טוען שהעולם גדול ואילו הוא קטן, הרי שואל הוא ממילא מי יקום יעקב כי קטן הוא. So by seeing the wilderness is great and ascribing importance to the rest of the world, so the person feels that he's small. And then he asks the question in the Navi, Mi Yakum Yaakov, who will bring up or elevate Yaakov? Yaakov is the name of smallness in the Jewish people. Ki katanu, because Yaakov is small. So who can possibly prop him up and make him into something important? So the very question, how am I going to stand firm in face of this big bad world, that itself creates exile. The concealment of Hashem. And it allows the world to control us, and that's the beginning of exile. But if a person remembers that you have chosen us from all the nations, and you have uplifted us, we don't need someone in particular. God does it through the Torah. So he's not impressed by anyone. He knows that the Jewish people are propped up higher than everyone else, but by Hashem. And so he has no exile, he doesn't feel exile. So God provides him with his parnasa, with his livelihood. He can run his life based on the Torah way. And he'll still have time to engage in Torah learning. So this is all very interesting. Now he's coming to what happens afterwards. But if you already begin to feel that the wilderness is great and weighty and important, so we said that the Pasuk said that it's midbar gadol v'anora makom nachash saraf v'akrav. Right, so we had that there's five adjectives. It's a wilderness, but it has 5 adjectives. It's great, it's greater than me. It's Norah, we'll see what that is in a moment. And it's filled with snakes, serpents, and scorpions. So these, he's going to say, are 5 levels of descent into exile. The exile is the wilderness, is being in the wilderness. But really being in exile is not being in the wilderness. You can be in the wilderness and still feel at home. You can feel like you're still connected to God. But if you keep descending into these adjectives of what the wilderness is like, so then you lose touch. So the next adjective is Norah. It's a terrible, great wilderness. It's not just a wilderness, it's not just great, it's also terrible. מובנו של גדול הוא שעלה גדול ממנו. To say that it's great is to say that it's greater than me, אבל מציאות בפני עצמה של מיעוט לפחות מהווה גם הוא. But still, he's greater than me, but I'm still something. When you say that it's nora, that it's terrible, nora comes from the word the terror. I'm afraid of it. פירושו שהוא ירא מן עלה. He's afraid of the wilderness. משום שהוא סובר שיש לו שליטה וממשלה עליו. Because now he feels it's not just that he's greater than me. He's not just a bully, or he's not just a stronger kid in the class, but he's also a bully. He's also terrorizes me. So he has control over me. That's what it means that the wilderness is terrible. כשהוא מחשיב את העולם לגדול בלבד, הרי הוא מתרשם מן העולם רק בשעה שהוא בא במגע עם העולם ועם ענייניו. If he only considers the wilderness to be great, so he's affected by it only when it comes in contact with the wilderness, with the rest of the world. But when he's not in contact with the rest of the world, so he's in his own world, in his world of Torah and mitzvahs. משום שהוא מכיר בגדולתו, וכשהוא נמצא בדל אמותיו, הוא מחזיק את עצמו איתן. ברם כשהוא רואה את העולם כמדבר גדול ונורא, but when he sees the wilderness is great and terrible, הרי גם כשהוא שרוי בדלת אמותיו, כשהוא נמצא בבית הכנסת, בישיבה ובביתו, אף אז יראו מן העולם. So even when he's at home, when he's in shul, when he's in the yeshiva, even in those times, he's afraid of the big bad world, and מפחד הוא לקיים תורה ומצוות בגלוי. He's afraid to keep Torah and mitzvahs openly. הוא חושש שמא ידע העולם מזה ומה יאמרו הגויים. He's afraid of what the world might say if it finds out that this is what he does. He does all these primitive things. מכאן עלולה לבוא ירידה נוספת, נחש. So now we get into a very interesting section. Section 6 is about 6 and 7 is about 5 and 6 is about the differences between the different qualities of the animal soul. So let's see. So you can come to another adjective. The new adjective is it's a place of snakes. So it's snakes, serpents, and scorpions. Okay. So he ties snakes and serpents together. He makes them into one thing. Nachash v'saraf, he says the same thing. Why? Because he says like this. בספר ערכי הכינויים נאמר שנחש ארסו חם. In the Halperin was his name. I can't remember, it was Yechiel Halperin was his name. Baal Seder Adorot. So he wrote many, many books. Most people know just the Seder Adorot, which is like an early compilation of all the histories brought down, the traditional histories brought down in the sages. If you buy it today, so you get a bonus. You get it with Shalshilta Kabbalah and other books that wrote on him. And there they also, apart from it being the most interesting reading, I think, in all of Yiddishkeit, but that's me because I love history. But and to see the sages' take on figures that you know, like who was Achilles, who was Aristotle, who was Plato, all these people, to see how they see them is very eye-opening, to say the least. But it's also full of Kabbalah. It's also full of, because of these additional books that were added into it, it's also full of the different gilgulim, the different incarnations of individuals. But it's a very interesting work in and of itself, the Seder Adorot. So he also wrote another 4 volumes, at least today it's in 4 volumes, called Erchei HaKinuim, which is like sort of like an encyclopedia of Kabbalah. And sages. It's sort of like an Aruch. The old one used to be called the Aruch. It was also by somebody called the Yechiel. Is from the 11th century, but he lived in the 17th century, so it's more updated in certain ways. Again, if you have a scientific mind, you don't read these things because they'll just raise more questions than. But if you know how to read this and you know how to take out I think the essential meaning of what he says, they're very. These books are very important. In any case, so he has there. And the Erchei HaKinuim is like his encyclopedia. He has entries on just about everything, and he writes there that the Nachash, his venom is hot. That's how they called it, that it's hot. What does it mean that it's hot? That it doesn't cause lethargy. It causes a person to burn. The feeling is one of burning when you're bit by a snake that has venom. ומשמעות הדבר שהאדם מתחיל להתלהב בהתלהבות חום העולם. So when it says that you go down into a wilderness that's full of snakes, What it means is that it's not just that you are afraid of the world and therefore you don't keep Torah mitzvot, or you hide it, or you conceal it, or you try to conform with the world, but rather you become excited by it. Then now you're attached to it. You want to connect to the worldly pleasures and the worldly habits that people have. ומתוך שהוא נתון בהתלהבות העולם, מתמעטת התלהבותו בקדושה. So we saw this in different contexts. The Rebbe always says that you can't be excited by two things at once. So either you're excited by the world or you're excited by Torah or holiness. You can't do both at the same time. ומכאן ירידה גדולה יותר שרף. And then the saraf comes, the serpent. התלהבותה, again, the serpent is also cham, it's also hot venom. התלהבותו לעולם גוברת במידה כזו, עד שלא זו בלבד שהיא ממעטת את התלהבותו לקדושה, אלא שהיא אף שורפת לגמרי את ההתלהבות הקדושה. But it's hotter. And so now it has the power to not only lessen your excitement about holiness, but it actually completely takes over. And you have no more interest in holiness. But then you come to you can come, chas v'chalila, to even lower descent. And that's a place of scorpions. And on scorpion, it says in Erchei HaKinuim she'ar so kar, it says that its venom is cold. דבר זה גרוע מן החש ושרף. This is worse than the snake and serpent. שכן, כשיש לאדם חום והתלהבות, למרות שלענייני העולם משמש הדבר הוכחה לחיוניות והתלהבות של קדושה. So I didn't have time to look at the Yiddish. I fear there's a little bit of a problem here in the sentence, but what he's saying is that when you come to cold venom, when you come to this place of scorpions, so it's the opposite. It's cold venom. What does it do? It makes you cold. It makes you indifferent. So you're not interested anymore you're not excited about anything. In fact, we'll see in a moment that it becomes something that the Rebbe spoke to some people, I know from personal eyewitness accounts. He spoke to certain people about that there's a very fine line between not being impressed by what you shouldn't be impressed by, and with being cold and indifferent. People think that it's better to just not be impressed. The Rebbe said it's not like that. Sometimes a person uses that as an excuse to just be indifferent, and then he's indifferent to everything. He's indifferent to suffering, he's indifferent to things that need to be changed, he's indifferent to atrocities, he can be indifferent to anything. Many times the Rebbe said, sometimes you're in a state where all you can do is demonstrate. You know the demonstration's not going to do anything. You can't change anything, but he says, when it hurts, you cry out. Okay. The demonstration sometimes is just to tell the world that this hurts me. I know the world doesn't care, but it hurts me. So I have to express that. If you're indifferent, you don't do that at all. You don't have that. So you have to be careful not to become cold. So let's see what he says here. So as long as it was just serpents and snakes, so you still had some heat. And like we said, it's a process. I have to see the Yiddish, but it's a process of the kedusha, of your excitement for holiness being lessened. It doesn't happen all at once. So you still have some excitement. But when you're stricken by these scorpions, when the world is a place of scorpions, so it becomes a world of indifference. It becomes cold. It's the opposite of life. Again, the snake comes to you with, let's have a good time. That's what it wants. So it's just telling you the good time is going to so-and-so to his party. The holiness is having a good time with Hashem. That's why we call it Farbrengen. Because we're also having a good time, because that's what it means. It means to have a good time. Farbrengen means to have a good time. So that's one thing, but when you become cold and indifferent, that's a whole different aspect of the wilderness, of the exile. It's the opposite of life. Garua upikama, it's many times worse. וכדוגמת גריעותו של עז לגבי שור נגח. And this is similar to how the goat is worse than the boring ox. Okay? Not boring. Goring, thank you. It sounded like strange. The boring company. Yeah. The goring ox. What is this talking about? So here he gives us a Marei Makom. Re'eh Kuntras HaTfilah Perek Chet. So Kuntras HaTfilah was written by the Rebbe Rashab to teach people how to daven. And one of the things he does in chapter 8 is he explains that it's not enough to learn something and then assume that by learning it I've been affected by it. He says you have to daven with it. Why? And when you daven with it, you have to go over all the details as you're davening. Why? Because after you learn something, even if you repeat it many times, if it doesn't become something emotional, if it doesn't translate into emotions, then it doesn't really stay. You can repeat it many, many times and remember the details, but it's not part of it. It's not integrated, right? It's not integrated into your being. And to integrate things into your being, that the work of the heart, of bringing something, integrating, the heart is what's considered to be the pnimius, the more internal, the integration, so that you do during davening. So there he is, in that chapter 8, he discusses the different types of nefesh behemis. There's different types. There are nefesh behemis that are like an ox. There's the animal souls that are like an ox. There's animal souls that are like a goat. He says, what's the difference? The ox is easily agitated. You just wave something in front of him, and he goes crazy, and he comes goring. He wants to kill you. The goat, he says, is indifferent. Can't move it. Doesn't care. It's interesting that we use a goat and not a donkey, but the reason is very simple. Because a donkey is not kosher. We're talking about the animal soul of a Jew. It has to be a kosher animal. So the kosher animal is the ez. So we usually think about an ez, we think about an ez like oz, like bold. But that's not that's not what it means. That azin shebaumot means the most obstinate. Am kshe oref. It means that you can't move them. I don't care. Say whatever you want. So he says, in holiness, it's not as good. It's better to have an animal soul, meaning a natural tendency to be agitated, to be someone who's indifferent. That's what he says there. It says you can't choose. I mean, you have what you have. You have the way you were created. But he says that the person who is indifferent has a harder time working on himself to change himself than the person who's like an ox. And that's like the idea that if it doesn't break things when it's young, it's not very useful when it's older. Like what people say to women who have hyperactive children, right? So you say to him, if he doesn't cause trouble when he's young, he won't be useful when he's older. Why? What's the idea behind it? Because if he has no energy. So right now, right now he's running, doing negative things, but he's at least running. He's doing something. He's excited. But if he's indifferent, he's like a goat. So it's going to be very hard to move him. And he's going to have a very hard time changing himself. So this is a big deal about this whole discussion. I was just saying it in short. This is there in length in Kuntras HaTfilah in chapter 8. It's a very important thing. So he says, if you're the type of person who's indifferent, you have a much harder time using davening to integrate things. It takes a lot more work. But you still have to do it. You have to work on it. So here too, the cold venom is worse than the hot venom, because the hot venom at least says you're alive. So if you're stricken by the snake or the serpent, you're still alive. But if you're stricken by the akrav, by the scorpion, it makes you cold. It's very interesting. Which month of the year is Scorpio? Cheshvan. You know Cheshvan.
Scorpion. I'm Cancer.
Yeah, that's in the summer sometime. No, what is it?
July.
Yeah. So what do we call it in the Hebrew? It's not called. No. No, we don't use that word at all. What you're now like in when's your birthday?
I'm a krav.
Oh, you are a krav.
I think so.
No,
Oh,
you said you're in July.
Satan.
So July is what? It's Sivan. It's not Sivan, so it's a Tammuz.
Tammuz.
ג'ייקוב, מה עם החשבונית זה? אתה יכול לשלוח לי וואטסאפ, להגיד לי?
Okay, well, we'll continue tomorrow, but because otherwise,
There's a big thing in Breslov. Lasot mi'atoyres tefillas.
yeah,
you know.
of course. That's the same idea as in Chabad. That you have to, whatever you learned, you have to.
Uh-huh. But it's mamish like every Torah.
Right.
Likkutei.
He made it into a
tefillah
tefillah.
lesson, yeah.
Okay.
And sometimes you don't understand the Torah until you
Until you
tefillah,
hear his commentary. Right. I remember that.
What's it,